Okay, good afternoon. This panel is held in the memory of Professor Ehud Sprinzak. Professor Sprinzak taught for 30 years at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem before joining the newly established Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, as it was called back in the days, now Reichman University. And here he helped establish the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy, where he became the founding dean. Professor Sprinzak was a world-renowned expert on terrorism at a time when you could still count the numbers of experts on one hand, maybe two. But his research spanned not only terrorism, but also corruption and the politics of extremism. And he's perhaps best known for his groundbreaking research on the radical right in Israel. His books earned critical acclaim. The Descendants of Israel's Radical Right was published in 1991 by Oxford University Press, won Israel's 1992 Michael Landau Prize for the best political science book on Israel and the Middle East. His another book, Brother Against Brother, Violence and Extremism in Israeli Politics from Altalena to the Rabin Assassination, was a finalist for the 1998 National Jewish Book Award. And Professor Sprinzak was really a trailblazer in more ways than one. He was one of the very few terrorism scholars who focused on right-wing extremism when many other experts really shunned politically charged issues. He was also a pioneer in the study of radicalization, and he was a pioneer in field research in terrorism studies. He wasn't really satisfied, with studying political extremists from a distance, but he preferred meeting his subjects of his research interests face to face, including, famously his encounters with Rabbi Meir Kahane, extremist Rabbi Meir Kahane, and actually the terrorists that he interviewed, they really respected him, even though, of course, they had very, very different views. Professor Sprinzak's unique and present insights on the topic of the radical right would have come in especially handy at a time when the far right is at a rise in Europe, North America, and also here in Israel. So Professor Sprinzak also served as an advisor to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin on these topics, and more importantly, perhaps, he was really beloved by an army of students that he trained. I was actually one of them. I first became familiar with the field of terrorism studies as a student of Professor Sprinzak, as an undergraduate student at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He had a wonderful sense of humor, which contrasted very much, with the dark subject matter of terrorism. So Professor Sprinzak, he died on November 8th, 2002, following a few very short months of illness at the age of 62, and he left behind his wife, Ricky, 4 children, and 2 grandchildren. And I would just like to mention that on the 8th of November, at the 20th anniversary of Professor Ehud Sprinzak's passing, this coming 8th of November, the Lauder School of Government and the ICT will hold a special event in his memory, and we will send a formal save-the-date announcement for the event next week. So may his memory be a blessing. Okay, obviously Professor Sprinzak would have had a lot to contribute to today's discussion on the far right, and it's really my pleasure to introduce 3 wonderful speakers today. We have only a limited amount of time, so I asked each of the speakers to start with a brief 5-minute remarks. And then hopefully we'll have time for one more round of questions that I'm going to direct at each one of them individually. Michael Signer, Dr. Michael Signer, who we were lucky enough that he joined us very recently as the inaugural Democracy Fellow of our program on democratic resilience and development, which is a program co-sponsored with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Dr. Signer is the former mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, from 2016 to 2018. His time coincided also with the Unite the Right rally. He is also the author of a number of books, including Cry Havoc, Charlottesville, and American Democracy Under Siege, and also the book Becoming Madison, The Extraordinary Origins of the Least Likely Founding Father, and also another book, Demagogue, The Fight to Save Democracy from Its Worst Enemies. It's fantastic to have you here. Mike, please.
Thanks. It's a great honor to be here. My family and I have really appreciated the hospitality and the camaraderie this fall, and this conference has been a wonderful experience. During the Unite the Right rally of August 2017, hundreds of right-wing paramilitary forces invaded the college town of Charlottesville, Virginia, and clashed with organized anti-fascist counter-protesters, residents, and police. The event was called to protest the planned removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. You could see a lot of the planning beforehand publicly on social media, but what was hidden on private chat rooms on a gaming platform called Discord was the planning among organized paramilitary groups who planned on coming with body armor and assault rifles to, quote, defend Charlottesville and openly clash with the far left. In the weeks leading up to the event, it was so clear, even from what was open source, that there would be violence, that the University of Virginia Hospital canceled all elective surgeries that weekend. Yet the organizers were always very careful to state their plans publicly in defensive or vague terms. That meant they couldn't be found under then existing First Amendment jurisprudence to be making what is called a credible threat. For instance, calls to beat up Antifa or to bring back gas chambers were not specific or imminent enough to lead to the event permit being canceled or not allowed. When the rally happened, it was even worse than the worst fears. A dozen paramilitary groups unloaded from buses in military formation, armed formally with insignias and command structures. There were hundreds of people carrying not only loaded weapons, but other kinds of weapons, flagpoles with screws in them, for instance, body armor, pepper spray, spray cans that were lit on fire. There were dozens of brawls on the street, fistfights, even a man firing a handgun at a black man. Fortunately, he missed him. There was so much violence that the event was shut down through a Virginia legal mechanism called, quote, unlawful assembly before it even hit its formal start time. This led some of the far left protesters to declare victory, but then a young neo-Nazi weaponized his car and drove it across the unguarded downtown pedestrian mall into a crowd of far left counter-protesters, killing a protester named Heather Heyer and badly injuring dozens of others. In the weeks to come, the apparent inability of the police to stop street fighting, the various acts and omissions that led to an unguarded downtown mall, and the failure of the city to win in a lawsuit that had been filed by the ACLU to prevent us from trying to move the lawsuit to an area where the groups could have been separated, led to increasingly infuriated residents. Council chambers were taken over on national television with residents getting arrested. Most of the city government eventually left, including the city manager, the chief of police, the city attorney, and the communications director. All of this happened despite many efforts to avert disaster beforehand. I consulted with mayors around the country on how they had successfully handled civic unrest situations. The Department of Homeland Security tried to ring an alarm bell, but the confidential memo someone at the state's fusion center wrote, which was titled Domestic Terrorist Violence at Lawfully Permitted White Supremacist Rallies Likely to Continue, sent around 4 days before the rally, appears never to have been read, and it was not referenced in the litigation that was going on at that time. And if all that sounds familiar, it's because it was a prelude to very similar facts happening in relation to the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., designed to stop the peaceful transition of power. There are many lessons for leaders to take from the experience in Charlottesville. First Amendment. I've written in my book, Cry Havoc, which Assaf referenced, about how we ended up with such a straitjacket on local elected officials when it comes to emphasizing public safety over unfettered hate speech in the United States. I believe this balance is actively being shifted by litigants and by jurists now as a result of the contortions we were forced to go through in Charlottesville. For instance, we were not allowed to present publicly or in court filings evidence of the cost of handling these events as a reason to deny the permit for them, because that, under existing law in America, would constitute a heckler's veto, allowing heckler to veto an event. But I think the courts are becoming more balanced now in considering all the evidence around such events as a result of Charlottesville. Lawsuits. There were aggressive and creative legal strategies that followed the event. Immediately afterward, the city, when I was mayor, successfully joined with Georgetown University to sue the paramilitary groups that invaded under a provision never used before, never invoked, of the Virginia Constitution that makes paramilitary groups unpermitted by the civilian authority illegal, and that prevented them from returning to the city. 4 years later, a private lawsuit successfully imposed crippling civil damages on the radical groups using a law originally written in the 19th century to prevent the Ku Klux Klan from terrorizing the public. Intelligence. Under the prior presidency, white nationalist groups were intentionally, a lot of research has shown, coddled as part of his base, so there was no effort to develop active human intelligence or to interfere with those networks, let alone to prepare local governments for such attacks. But now there are, fortunately, based on these learnings, many more federal resources being brought to this work. And planning and coordination. I was struck yesterday by the collaboration that has been achieved among Israel's different domestic and foreign military intelligence and police forces to handle today's terrorist threats. It requires a lot of humility, fallibility. Even 15 years after the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the state fusion centers, the events in Charlottesville revealed how much we need coordination in the United States. When we commissioned an independent study afterward by a leading law firm, we learned the state police force had more officers on site than the local police, but they had separate briefings even on the day of the event, and they weren't literally on the same radio frequency. There were no tabletop exercises done between the various parties. Riot gear was stationed several blocks away, so when the violence became too intense, the police actually had to leave the scene to go get hardened for the attacks that were happening. There weren't separate parking areas to the far right and far left, so they mingled and fought before, after, during, and after the event. And most importantly, there was no security pin prepared that would effectively separate the groups with green space between them. All failures similar to what happened in Washington, D.C. during January the 6th. We have to do better. My hope is that we will learn, because if the last 5 years shows anything, it's that polarization and political violence are on the rise in the United States, and coordination and adaptation by all of government, specifically on the local level, is more necessary than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Signer. And okay, our second speaker is going to be Gina Ligon, who's the Director of National Counter-Terrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Insight, and professor at the College of Business Administration at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, which is a DHS Center of Excellence. She has specific expertise in innovation and leadership and has published over 70 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on these subjects. And she's here for the first time in Israel, so welcome, Gina. Please, the floor is yours.
Mysteriously went away, so I guess that means I have no time limit. Is that what that means? Just kidding. I'll be succinct. So in May of this year, there was a young man who specifically targeted a supermarket in North Upstate New York because of most of the people who attended that supermarket were of African American ethnicity. This past August, another man drove to an FBI office in Cincinnati, Ohio, and his plot was thwarted, but it was to kill as many FBI agents as possible. So these two recent attacks in the United States represent two different strands of what I think we're talking about today, although we don't call it right-wing extremism when we do research funded by Department of Homeland Security anymore. In my time here today, I will talk about my role as the director of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Consortium for Counterterrorism and Targeted Violence Research. And it's actually the largest academic consortium in the United States. We have 60 plus researchers, 26 institutions, 3 of them are outside of the U.S. And between now and 2030, I will be responsible for allocating $32 million of funding on behalf of DHS for academics looking at counterterrorism and targeted violence research. So with my brief time today, what I'm going to do is share how America doesn't call it right-wing extremism anymore, at least DHS doesn't, because what we're doing is we're getting much more specific in how we define it. And these two attacks are symbolic of that. And I'll also share one recent trend from our partner at George Washington Program on Extremism, who the authors are here, who just wrote a report about attacks on critical infrastructure and what has me most concerned about what's coming next. So first, why we don't call it right-wing extremism. There's a host of reasons. I won't get into the political nature of them, but you have them in your country as well, in Israel. But what we're talking about is the nature of what the target actually is. So the two terms that the U.S. is using right now are RIMVY and agave extremism. So RIMVY is racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. So this is your traditional white supremacy, white power movements, anti-Semitic groups. The top supermarket was a RIMVY terrorist attack. It was against blacks in the U.S. The second strain of right-wing extremism that DHS has us looking at is called agave. And so agave stands for anti-government, anti-authority violent extremism. And these are individuals who are motivated to replace the current societal power structures as they exist right now. Most of them don't have a plan for what comes next, but most of their attacks are targeted against government and anyone who represents an authority figure. So could be healthcare, could be academic institutions, could be financial institutions. So we've gotten more precise with these definitions, and I think it's a good thing as an academic. It helps us to predict what kind of targets these two different strains will likely go after. And so that leads me to my final point, which is really what has me most concerned. And so the way DHS defines, we don't have a domestic terrorism law in the US, as you know, but the way that they are defining what matters to them is around the critical infrastructure sectors. And so critical infrastructure, shorthand is just facilities that, if they were attacked, would cause significant problem with the functioning of our society. There's 16 different sectors: commerce, chemical, energy, financial sectors. And so the way DHS looks at it is, how do we help the public and private owners and operators of that critical infrastructure to protect themselves against these threats? And so that leads to the report that GW just released last week on behalf of our consortium, which really compared Salafi jihadist attacks on critical infrastructure in the US and right-wing extremism attacks against critical infrastructure in the US. And one of the most alarming things that I saw from that is that not only are both agave and RIMVY attacks increasing against critical infrastructure in the US, but the one that they're targeting the most is our power grid and the energy sector. And so the way that these authors described that was that it's the lead domino, and that if there is an attack on the power grid and our energy structure, it's going to have a cascade of consequences for the replacement of our society as we know it. And so that's the threat that has me most concerned, are the accelerationist threads between RIMVY and agave. So these are narratives that seek societal collapse. RIMVYs want to rebuild into a white supremacist society. Agaves haven't quite articulated exactly what they want to do, but they want to get rid of the society as it exists right now. And so in closing, I shared what we've been doing at Insight to get the government to listen. Part of it is being more specific. And so when you call it right-wing or left-wing, it immediately has a political implication, especially in the United States. And so getting specific with our definitions has really helped us to be able to get policymakers to consume our research and take some action on it. And then the second point that I just wanted to make was the attack on critical infrastructure. I know terrorism researchers often focus on soft targets and the loss of life. But for us in the United States, one of the things that keeps me up at night is what's going to happen when we go dark, and what's going to happen to the rest of our global partners when we do. So I'm just thrilled to be here and make some partnerships and figure out how we can fight this together. So looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ligon. And our third speaker of the panel is my colleague, Dr. Daniel Milton, Director of Research at the Combating Terrorism Center at the United States Military Academy, my former employer, and an associate professor in the Department of Social Sciences. Dan, please.
Thank you, Assaf. It's always good to be here. When you initially started with your very touching words about Professor Sprinzak, you mentioned that he had a sense of humor, and then you said compared to, and I thought you were going to say compared to your lack thereof, but of course that wouldn't be accurate because everyone that knows Assaf knows he has a wonderful sense of humor, and it's a delight to be here and to be able to speak on such a distinguished panel. Given that time is short, I will just go ahead and dispense very quickly with a disclaimer. Anything that I say doesn't represent the US government or my employer. That's going to be helpful because, as I mentioned to Gina before the panel started, I had two sets of notes that I was going to share. One was controversial, one was not. I'll go ahead and flip to the controversial because I think that that will hopefully be more entertaining and exciting in terms of conversation. I want to talk just briefly in the time that I have about 5 things that we get wrong about January 6th and sometimes about the far right. And the hope in doing this is to spur conversation and thought and potentially future research to limit the ability of these things to happen again. So I'll make those 5 points. There's a lot of substance behind them. I don't have time to go into that, but here we go. It is common, number one, the thing that we get wrong, we say that those who supported or participated in the events of January 6th are uneducated conspiracy theorists who didn't know, or at least did not fully anticipate the kind of the gravity of their situation. Of course, as it turns out, when we dig into the research, and the team at George Washington University has compiled a lot of great data on this, we find that there's actually a tremendous amount of diversity among the participants of January 6th. We like to label them, we like to think about them in one way, and that just hampers our ability to actually redress the underlying challenges that they pose. We find among them blue-collar workers, professionals, young, old, male, female, all sorts of diversity, which is not surprising to students of terrorism, right? If you've studied the subject long enough, you know that one of the hallmark findings is that there really isn't a specific or a particular profile. That's true in this case as well, but I think that we sometimes forget that. The second thing that we get wrong is that we tend to attribute responsibility for January 6th entirely to a former president of the United States. Now, this is a bit of an interesting one, and I certainly would be the last person to excuse or diminish, but I think that what we tend to misattribute is his role as being causal instead of inflammatory. Indeed, his words, his rhetoric, and other things were not helpful, his actions to a certain extent. However, when we think about what actually drives people to engage in extremism, we tend to have what Amy Ziegert refers to as the finger-pointing fallacy. We find the easiest thing, we point at it, and we say, that's the reason. And when we do that, again, we hamper our ability to understand the underlying causes and to come up with appropriate remedies. Are there things that we need to look at on a political front? Absolutely. But if we focus on those things alone, we run the risk of missing, I think, the more important pieces. Number 3, January 6th served as a very clear signal that the threat posed by the far right is kind of a harbinger of things to come. Maybe this is just more of a kind of an optimistic take, but terrorism is political by nature. Right? Its very definition encourages us to think about politics. The factors that drive it are also political in nature. And so to simply say that because we've seen a terrible string of events, we must anticipate that there will be more of them, removes agency from both the perpetrators and those who focus on counterterrorism as a profession. We have to be willing to engage with this subject and to hope that positive actions and positive progress can lead to a diminishment of a future risk. And of course, in the same light, negative actions can certainly increase that risk. Number 4, and this is particular to some research that I've conducted with a colleague of mine at George Washington University. We did a report looking at military experience among individuals who were indicted for their actions on January 6th. And one of the things that people take away from that is, hey, the relative percentage of people who had military experience in January 6th is about the same as what it is in the population. Therefore, there's no real reason to be concerned about this. That's a terrible line of logic. And as it turns out, the only reason that we would expect the same proportions to exist is if we thought that the same causal processes were at play. I don't have any reason to believe that, and in fact, I think that there's reason to suspect that certain groups are targeted more for recruitment, for participation, because of the credibility, the gravitas that they lead and lend to these causes. And I think that we need to be very concerned among our security forces about any perception of impropriety or inability to execute the laws as we all faithfully swear to uphold. And then finally, the last thing that I will point out is that we've started talking about January 6th in a historical perspective, as if it is over. Just this morning, the Department of Justice in the United States released 40 subpoenas related to individuals and actions on January 6th. This is an ongoing, I think, incident, and unfortunately, I think there's more to come. If you've followed the kind of extremist chat as it relates to some of these things, January 6th has become almost a focal point for them to rally and to regroup, and so we need to be concerned about where it might lead in the future. That's all I've got, and happy to discuss offline with anybody if they have any questions or pushback. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you so much, Dan. And Stevie Weinberg has granted me graciously 3 more minutes for a round of questions. And so I think, I noted so many questions I have for each of you individually, but I think I'm just going to ask one question to each three of you because I would like to get your perspective on. And this is when we look at the threat of the far right in general, right? I mean, I think we tend to sometimes look at the violent threat. And for example, Gina, in your remarks, you mentioned, I can't remember the acronyms. Grimby and Agave, right? But they both involve like violent actors, or the idea of violent actors. But how much should we be worried about far right, not just as a phenomenon that is related to violence, but also about the nonviolent aspects of the far right? And if we're talking about the nonviolent aspects of the far right, like the mainstreaming of extremist ideas, the politics of extremism. Is terrorism and violence really the proper framework, or should we kind of broaden our whole understanding and language about this threat? Maybe I'll start with Mike.
Real quick, I think that violence is a symptom of an underlying deeper erosion of commitment to democratic practices. It's what I'm working on this fall here. You have a program on democratic resilience with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and my deepest concern is that we're hitting a point where polarization is accelerating, and a lot of the research on polarization shows that because it's a tribal phenomenon, our values are basically socially constructed, that the in-groups and out-groups can get worse and worse over time. And whatever we can do to at least slow down, check the underlying collapse of commitment to the core institutions of democratic functioning, to me, is the most essential thing right now. I think the violence is symptomatic of underlying deeper societal, sociocultural problems. That's pessimistic, but it's how I feel.
I actually do think terrorism is the right framework to study right-wing extremism in the United States. So my actual research strain is Salafi jihadist leadership. And I likened a lot of the problems we're seeing in the United States. They have more in common than people realize. And also the whole nature of the broader Ummah and the support for Salafi jihadist movements and violence and the worry that we had about that. I think we should liken to what we did to try to defeat that, to also looking at how this broader group in the United States is sort of condoning violence, maybe not acting violently, but at least tacitly accepting it and giving psychological permission to conduct it. So I think it's absolutely the right framework, and I think there's a lot to offer from counterterrorism experts to what's happening in the US right now.
I don't know that I have a lot to add other than to say that I I think that terrorism is the right way to think about the end result and how to prevent and deal with that. But the further you move kind of into the preventative space, I think you need to broaden your aperture for how you deal with the problem. It might be from a public health framework. It might be from kind of a social services framework. It might sometimes be from a law enforcement or terrorism framework. But I think that we have to be willing to engage with all of those different perspectives and approaches. And I think that that's actually something that most research institutes, ICT, NSIT, CTC do pretty well, is they try to take that interdisciplinary approach to understanding the problem, and I think that that can be helpful. But at the end of the day, we're trying to prevent and deal with violence. And so I think that the kind of terrorism framework can be very helpful for that end product.
Excellent, great. Thank you very, very much. I think we reached the end of our time, so, but I'm sure we'll have a lot of offline conversations. And so thank you so much to the panelists, Dr. Michael Signer, Dr. Gina Ligon, and Dr. Daniel Milton. Thank you.